If you've hung out with kids very much, one thing that you have learned is that kids love to ask questions and make some of the craziest statements that we can possibly make. In fact, even though all of us were at one time kids, I think we forget really quickly just the kind of things that we wondered about when we were young. Now, you might occasionally have something pop into your head like, oh yeah, I remember wondering that when I was growing up, but then a child asks it and we go, where in the world would they come up with that? Totally forgetting that we once came up with those same types of things, such as, I read a story about a son who asked another child of this person. It says, my son asked my 7-year-old, this isn't my son, I promise I'm not telling embarrassing stories about my children this week, my son asked my 7-year-old how she would survive a bear attack, just out of the blue. And when the 7-year-old replied, she said that she would try to be its friend, thus making her the most adorable of my children, but also the most likely to never survive an encounter with an actual bear. Or how about this one? My son just asked me if when I was little, I had to stay inside for COVID's 1 through 18. Let that one sink in just a little bit. COVID-19, stay indoors. What happened during COVID's 1 through 18, Mom? When I explained to my son what a C-section was, he asked me, then what is an A and B section? My child asked me, why do we have 2 arms instead of 3? Wouldn't 3 be better? Or how about this one? And this one's going to hit really hard for some of us sitting in this room. In fact, I'm going to need you to just take a quick breath real quick and just prepare yourself for this one. While watching It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, my daughter asked if it was from the 1900s. So if you need be, I'll be researching retirement homes while handing out butterscotch candies to trick-or-treaters. When we're young, don't we ask, there are TV shows that have been made about this, about kids say the darndest things, and kids ask the craziest questions. I can, again, I'm not going to embarrass my kids, but I can just go back and remember some of those questions that they have asked, some that they continue to ask, that I just sat there and I went, man, what led your mind to ask that question? That's something that I really just don't remember wondering about. But as we get older, we have a tendency, and I think this is true for pretty much everybody, we have a tendency to start being safer with our questions. We get to an age, we get to a stage in our life where, at least for me, and maybe I'm just speaking for myself here, where I still wonder about some crazy things, but I'm afraid to ask the question because I think that everybody's going to roll their eyes at me. I can go back and I can think of some of the questions that I had in college that a professor would bring something up, and I'm sitting there going, I have no idea what this guy is talking about right now, but I am not going to be the one who's going to ask the question. Now, nowadays, what we would have a tendency to do is we would pull out our phones and we would very discreetly say, hey, Siri, what does this mean? And then we would ask the question rather than be embarrassed enough to ask it out loud. I remember when I was in college when this one happened, and I'm a little ashamed to admit it, but I'm going to admit it anyway. Going out to, actually maybe it was high school, maybe it wasn't college yet. But I was out in Portland, Oregon, which is a little bit more advanced in technology things typically than the areas where I have lived and grown up and everything. And I went out and we went into a coffee shop, which I wasn't drinking coffee at that point anyway, so I did not frequent those types of establishments. Walk in and I see on the menu, free Wi-Fi. And my first thought is, because if you know me, I don't like to spend money. I'm a very frugal person. In fact, some would call it just plain old cheap. But I look at it and I go, if it's free, that's what I want. And so I looked at my brother and I said, hey, what does Wi-Fi taste like? And my oldest brother, who is actually a very loving person, just kind of gave me that look like, you're an idiot. Now, I am thankful that in that moment, he didn't actually proceed to make up something as to what Wi-Fi would taste like so that I would walk up to the counter and say, I'd like a large Wi-Fi, please. He was kind enough to at least inform me what it really was eventually. I'm sure he gave me a hard time there for a little bit. But don't we have those wonderings, and we're just afraid to ask the questions. We're told that we're supposed to ask and question everything. In fact, the Greek philosopher Socrates, one of his well-known sayings was, question everything. So that when you actually decide what you believe, you have a firm foundation for the beliefs that you have. And so in different settings that we're in, whether it be the education setting, whether it be a church setting, whether it be wherever it is, we are encouraged, ask questions, question everything. Don't just take everything at face value. We hear the phrase, this is a safe space to ask questions, but in our minds, what we often think or what we often feel is that this is a safe space to ask questions as long as I don't ask the wrong question. Consider some of the issues that our country faces, that our world faces. You can ask in different settings all the questions you want about LGBTQ issues, but depending on the setting that you are in that moment, will depend on which questions you feel are the safe questions to ask. If you're in what we would generally consider to be a more liberal setting, you are free to ask all of the questions about those types of issues as long as you don't sit there and question whether or not it's the right way to live or the moral way to live or whether or not it's sinful. As long as you stay away from those, it's safe. And in a church setting, what many would feel and what many churches have lived out is you can ask all the questions you want about LGBTQ issues as long as you don't start asking whether or not it's okay. As long as you don't express that perhaps you have some of those leanings and some of those tendencies. As long as you don't ask the question, why would God create some people with homosexual leanings and then turn around and say that it's not okay to act them out? See, in a church setting, that's often not believed to be a safe question to ask. And that's just one issue, people. We could go on and on about, in different settings, you can ask about evolution or creation. In different settings, you can ask about science or you can ask about faith. In different settings, you can ask about God, but the question is going to be different, and what you'll feel is safe in that setting based on where you are in that moment. Because we tend to grow up as kids, no question is off the table. It doesn't matter where you are. In fact, I don't remember it. My mom tells me the story enough that I think that I remember it, of asking the question in a public setting that you never ask in a public setting, and her squeezing my hand so hard that I began to ask her why she was trying to break my hand. Publicly ask the question, why are you trying to get me not to ask that other question, and you're hurting me now because of it? Because as a kid, I didn't get it. And then I grew older, and now it gets to the point where, there's some things I wonder about that I wonder if it's safe to ask the question. In church settings, what we often try and convince people is that it is safe to ask questions here. But I know that there are many people who, it doesn't matter how many times we say that, they don't believe it. And you may be one of those people. You may be one of those people that is sitting there questioning some big things about God and not feeling like this is actually a safe place where you can ask it. And if you're not feeling that, I would almost guarantee you that you are sitting near a young person who does feel that way. Now, depending on your age, young person may mean something different. So I'm just going to say, period. A younger person than you who is feeling that way, who is feeling like this is not a safe place to ask the questions that I have. But church, I don't believe that Jesus has ever had the mentality that there is a question that is unsafe to ask. In fact, I want us to look at the beginning of his ministry, what we would call his ministry. Obviously, his ministry didn't start at the age of 30 and end at the age of 33. It began before that, and it has continued on after it. But that stage of his life that we look at and we generally consider to be his ministry, we're going to look at an interaction that he had at the beginning of it, and we're going to look at an interaction that he had at the very end of it. So if you want to turn to John chapter 1 and then John chapter 20, if you want to put a finger in both of those places, or if you're using your phone, you can scroll back and forth between the two of them, however you're looking at it. But Jesus, he comes upon the scene in John chapter 1, and we've got history that we can look back on. We can read the stories. We can see some of the things that happened in his life before this moment. But as he walks onto the scene at this point in John chapter 1, he's beginning to call his disciples to follow him, the people that we would consider to be the 12 disciples. And we read these stories of him coming to these men and saying, hey, come and follow me. He's begun to do some things. He's begun to get a little bit of a reputation of somebody who is able to teach with power and authority, and who's able to do miracles that blow people out of the water. He's begun to get some of this reputation. And then we come across this interaction that he has with a man named Nathanael. If you want to look at verse 33 of John chapter 1, it says, "The next day Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, 'Come, follow me.' Philip was from Bethsaida, Andrew and Peter's hometown. Philip went to look for Nathanael and told him, 'We have found the very person Moses and the prophets wrote about.'" Now, remember, that is a big, big statement, because the prophets had been writing about somebody that was going to come, that was going to free the people from oppression. This isn't just some random dude that they said, hey, sometime somebody's going to do a cool thing. This was the guy. And Moses isn't just some random name. Moses was the guy in Israelite history. He was the one, Moses, Elijah, these were the big, big names in Israelite history. And he's saying, this is the guy that Moses told us about. His name is Jesus, the son of Joseph from Nazareth. And Nathanael's immediate response: Nazareth? Can anything good come from Nazareth? Immediately, he is putting Jesus to the test. He is questioning the authority of Jesus. He is questioning whether Jesus could actually be this man that they've all been hearing about their entire lives. This man that Philip, his trusted, person in his life, that Philip is telling him about. Nazareth, can anything good come from Nazareth? And Philip responds, "Come and see for yourself." And as they approached, Jesus said, looking at Nathanael, never having had a conversation with him before, "Now here is a genuine son of Israel, a man of complete integrity." "How do you know about me?" Nathanael asked. And Jesus replied, "I could see you under the fig tree before Philip found you." And Nathanael exclaimed, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God, the King of Israel." Jesus asked him, "Do you believe this just because I told you I had seen you under the fig tree? Because you're going to see way greater things than this." Jesus tells Nathanael, "Hey, I saw you when you wondered if I was really legit. I saw you and I heard you when you were asking questions about who I am." And rather than look at Nathanael and just say, "Hey, you've got to learn to just trust, man. You've got to learn to just have faith, man. You've got to learn to just believe, man." No, actually what happens when he sees Nathanael, he says, "This is a man of integrity." I see underneath this, as he's saying this, that this is a man who doesn't just sway with the wind and listen to everything that he's being told. This is a man who doesn't believe it just because his friends believe it and just because his friends tell him that he should believe it. This is a man who's going to make sure that it's true. This is a man that is going to make sure that his beliefs are upon a firm foundation. Jesus doesn't lecture him for it. He says, "Oh, you're going to see some awesome things." But he doesn't sit there in that moment and scold Nathanael for asking questions about him. In fact, he almost seems to encourage it. Now let's fast forward 3 years to John chapter 20. Yeah, we can read it in a couple hours, but this is over miracle after miracle after miracle, teaching after teaching after teaching, where the disciples, these men, these women who have followed Jesus the closest, they have seen the things that he has done. They have heard the things that he has taught. They have professed their belief in him, but now Jesus has died. He's gone to a cross and he died. Oh, they profess, yeah, you are the Messiah. You are the one that Moses said was coming. You are the one Elijah said was coming. You are the one that all of these prophets said was coming. We believe. But then he died. And it didn't happen the way that they thought it was going to happen. And you would think, some of us, we would have been just like the ones who were like, it was all fake. And some of us would have been the ones that were sitting there going, no, there's got to be more to this story. We come across this man named Thomas who comes in with all of his buddies, and his buddies say, hey, guess what? We saw Jesus. Like Jesus has risen from the dead. Now you've seen Jesus raise somebody from the dead. You've seen him change water into wine. You've seen him heal the lame. You've seen him give sight to the blind. You've seen him do all of these different things. You've heard him teach things. You've heard him say that I'm going to tear down the temple and in 3 days I'm going to restore it. You've heard all of this. You've grown close with these men who are telling you we've seen Jesus. You've had to get over some of your differences that you have with one another, and they've been some big differences. You've grown together. You're a cohesive unit. They tell you this is true. Are you going to believe it? Because Thomas didn't. One of the 12 disciples is verse 24 in chapter 20. One of the 12 disciples, Thomas, nicknamed the twin, was not with the others when Jesus came. They told him, we have seen the Lord. But he replied, I won't believe it. I won't believe it unless I see the nail wounds in his hands, put my fingers into them, and place my hand in the wound in his side. Guys, I'm not going to believe it just because you tell me to. Just because you tell me it's true, I'm going to need to see some proof. I'm going to need to see some evidence. And 8 days later, the disciples were together again, and this time Thomas was with them. The doors were locked, but suddenly, as before, Jesus was standing among them. Peace be with you, he said. And then he said to Thomas, put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Don't be faithless any longer. Believe. My Lord and my God, Thomas exclaimed. And then Jesus told him, you believe because you have seen me. Blessed are those who believe without seeing me. Jesus could have walked into that room, however it happened, and that's one of those stories that I read. I'm like, what does that mean that he just came through the door? What? The door was locked and he's in the room. It's one of those questions that I would love to ask him. What did that look like? But he could have walked in and said, Thomas, how could you doubt me? Thomas, how could you ask those questions? You've been with me for the past 3 years. Do you remember the things that you saw me do? Do you really think that this was out of the realm of possibility for me? How could you not just have faith? Why are you asking for proof? Have you not seen enough proof over the past 3 years? But instead, Jesus comes into the room and he says, hey, Thomas, put your hand right here. This is proof. This is evidence. I'm not lecturing you for your doubt. I'm showing you. Put your hand right here. Hey, Thomas, put your hand right here. This is proof. This is evidence. You ask the question, here's the answer. I really am back. I really did rise again from the dead, Thomas. Now, you believe this because you've seen, and there's going to be people who aren't going to physically see me. Blessed are they who believe. And I think the church has taken those words and they've been, in certain circumstances, I'm not saying everyone in the church has done this and every pastor has done this, but this is the mentality, this is the interpretation that people have taken from what the church has said, that the church has begun to say or has said. What Jesus said there is, hey, believe without seeing. Don't question things. But in both of these circumstances, we don't see Jesus afraid or offended by the questions that are asked, by the doubts that are raised. He doesn't lecture, he doesn't tear them down, he doesn't say, how in the world could you not believe after everything that you've seen? He simply says, hey, let me show you. We often become afraid of the questions that people ask. And I think there's a lot of different reasons that we become afraid of the questions people ask. I think one of them is that we are offended that you didn't just believe me in the first place. After all, I'm educated. I went to school for this. I got a master's in this. I know what I'm talking about, people. You don't sit there and doubt, the whoever in their job over here. I mean, you don't sit there and doubt the doctor the way that you doubt me. I mean, we get afraid and we get offended because you don't just believe me. But I think we also become afraid of people's questions because we have the same ones. And we haven't asked them. And we don't know how to answer them. And sometimes that's because we haven't put in the work. Sometimes it's because we buried it out of fear. There's all sorts of different reasons as to why I could feel unprepared for the questions that you're going to ask. And it's a lot easier to just tell you don't ask it than it is to have to admit to you that I don't know the answer. And so we become afraid. And when we become afraid, we cease being a safe place for people to ask questions. We become a place and we become a people where it's just shut up and go along with what it is that you're hearing. Socrates, like I said, was the one who said to question everything so that you can have a firm foundation for your beliefs. But Jesus said this in Matthew chapter 7. He says, therefore, anyone or everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on a rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell with a great crash. We can say all of the right things. We can profess our belief in Jesus, but at the foundation that we have under ourselves is loose. At the foundation that we have under ourselves is full of hidden doubts. At the foundation that we have under ourselves is just simply because so-and-so told me so. Then when the rains come, when young people go off to school, and they're not under the protective umbrella of their parents' home where their parents say, no, you can't do that and you can't do that. And instead they're hearing, no, this is fair game, go for it. When we grow older and we begin to get into real life and the tough decisions really become a part of our lives, those questions that we didn't ask so that we could build a firm foundation and know what our beliefs were put on instead of just what our parents believed or our grandparents believed or our church believed, because I don't have anything for it to stand on, it washes clear. It hasn't always been the way in the church for people to say, just don't ask questions about certain things. There are a lot of churches, and I think anyway, that as a local congregation that we are group of people where people feel a little bit more comfortable asking some of the tough questions, but I'm not naive. I know that there are questions that some of you are sitting there with that you don't feel like you can ask. That if you ask it, you're either going to be looked at as like, how do you not know that? Like, how long have you been a Christian and you don't know what that means? Church, I grew up in the Church of God. I went to a Church of God college, and I got to that Church of God college, and they began talking about this thing called sanctification. And I went, and I sat there, and I went, what? What in the world? I'm getting a ministry degree, and I didn't know what sanctification was. And some of you are sitting there going, I don't know what sanctification is. And you're feeling the exact same way that I felt. But you know what I didn't ask? What's sanctification? Instead, I sat there and I nodded my head like I knew what in the world they were talking about. And then 3 years later, when I had to write a paper on it, I realized, oh man, I'm in trouble. My foundation is not sturdy here, at least when it comes to this part, because I didn't ask the question. But the church used to be a place where they encouraged questions, even of the hardest kind, even the type of like, hey, is God real? Did Jesus really die? Did he really rise again? Is this all just made up? Even those kind of questions. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, we read Paul writing to the church of Thessalonica. He says, do not quench the spirit. Do not treat prophecies with contempt, but test everything that is said. Test everything that is said. Church, he wasn't talking about test everything that the world says and whether or not it's true. He says don't treat the prophecies with contempt. Not world prophecies. Don't treat the prophecies that you're hearing about in this local group of people called the Way, that we now call the church. Test it all. Hold on to what is good and reject every kind of evil. In 1 John 4:1, we read, dear friends, do not believe everyone who claims to speak by the Spirit. You must test them to see if the Spirit they have comes from God. For there are many false prophets in the world, and they would have had memorized, and they would have been quoting out of Proverbs 14:15, only simpletons believe everything they're told. The prudent carefully consider their steps. Man, I read that one, that almost feels a little bit harsh. Only simpletons believe everything they're told. But I think most of us have experienced at some point, now we've experienced it outside the church too, don't get me wrong. I'm not just throwing the church under the bus here. But we are in a church setting. And so I think it's okay if we talk about our people at this point. But I think most of us have experienced in a church setting that feeling of, I better not test this. I better not ask this question. In fact, it's sometimes like pulling teeth to get people to ask the questions that I know they have. I was speaking with a woman from our community just within the past couple of weeks who was talking about how she had a conversation with her pastor. She doesn't attend, or she doesn't gather with us on Sunday mornings. But she was having a conversation with her pastor where she was, in her words, he probably thought that I was a lunatic. Because I was asking, like crying while she was asking, how could God let something like this happen? She was afraid that her pastor thought she was a lunatic for asking the question that a lot of people were asking. That how could God let something like this happen? And I looked at her and I said, I'm going to be real with you. I can't speak for your pastor. I don't know your pastor personally. But as a pastor, I would be relieved if people would just ask the question that I know they're thinking. Instead of trying to butter it up with but I know he's good and I know it's all cut. No, just ask the question and just say it the way that you're feeling it. Church, Jesus isn't afraid of it. God's not afraid of it. He already knows that it's in there. And I will tell you for myself personally, I'm not afraid of it. I might not have the answer for you. I might not have a satisfactory answer for you to where you walk away and you sit there and go, okay, now I'm completely comfortable with this. I might not have the answer that makes you feel good. In fact, a lot of times the answer that we get doesn't make us feel good, even if it's the truth. But even if I don't have those answers the way that you want them, or I don't have the answer at all, I'm not afraid of the question. And my hope is that we can be a people that aren't afraid of those questions, so that we don't continue to see young people walk away from this because they're afraid to ask the questions. Blind faith is not a virtue. Blind faith is not something that we're called to do and something that we're called to have. Because blind faith becomes buried questions. And buried questions become doubts. And buried doubts become unbelief. If you just push it down and you push it down and you push it down, church, those questions and those doubts, they're still in there. You can butter it up with every Christianese word that you want to come up with, but it's still there. And so the early church leaders, the early followers of the way, they said, ask them. Test everything. I've told you that before up here. Test everything that I say. In fact, I'm not afraid if you come back at me and you say, Justin, I don't agree with that. I think you were a little off on that. Some people have done that, and I've had to admit to them, like, you know what? You're right. I was wrong. There have even been a time or two where I've come back up here and I've confessed to all of you, like, hey, I was off on that one. It doesn't mean that I'm always going to say you're right, because the reality is sometimes you're not. Sometimes I'm not. I don't say that flippantly as an excuse for myself. I say that to say test it all. And test it doesn't mean wonder about it for the next 30 seconds and then squash it. Test it means put in the effort and run it down. And sometimes it's going to take you 30 minutes, and sometimes it's going to take you 30 years, people. But that blind faith will just continue to become more questions and more doubts until the day comes where you say, I don't even know that I believe all this stuff anymore. In your pews in front of you, you've heard us talk about the connection cards, and they should be in front of all of you. What I would encourage you to do this morning, what I'm asking you to do, is write your questions on there. You can put your name on it, or you don't have to. But write your names on there, or write your questions on there, and then put them in the box in the back. This is an active way that I want to come along with you, but that it also is an active way for you to actually voice the question that you have. And the reason for that is that over the next several weeks, we're going to spend some time asking some big questions. We've got some of those questions already planned out, that we know which questions we're going to look at. Over the next several weeks, we're going to look at the big question of, hey, is Jesus really God? Did he even claim to be? And we're going to ask the question of, why does it even matter if he was? And I think it matters because, well, if he was God, then that means that this God who created all of this was willing to come down and be one of us and to live with us. We're going to put it to the test as to whether or not there's actually any kind of evidence that we can look at, medically speaking in particular, as to whether or not Jesus actually died on that cross. And you might sit there and say, why does it matter if he died on the cross? Because if he died on the cross, then that means that God who created everything, who came down to live with us, was willing to give everything up for us and suffer for us. And we're going to spend some time looking at whether or not science can explain away the miracles that Jesus performed. It's a question and it's a doubt that we've heard proposed. And so we're going to spend some time, are science and faith at odds with one another? And we're going to partially answer the question is, why does that matter? Because if he was able to do the things that we actually read that he did, then it means that the God who created all of this, who came down to be with us, who gave it all up for us, has power over all of this. And then he said, I give that power to you. So what does that mean? But beyond that, we want to answer some other questions, and we want to answer questions that you are actually asking. Your students have asked some, your teenagers, high school, middle school, they've asked some, and they've spent some time on Wednesday nights and Sunday nights to the best of Pastor Mike's ability answering those questions. And so we might answer some of those that the students specifically ask, but they've had some time to answer those. I want to know what questions you have. This is a safe place to ask them. There's not going to be a moment where I stand up here and I go, I can't believe that somebody in this place is doubting this. My bet is that if you're questioning it, there's somebody else in here who is too. So I can just come up with them and answer questions you're not even wondering about. Or we can spend some time answering yours. And on those days where you come in here and we're talking about a question that you have so much confidence in, then perhaps that's the morning where you gain another tool in your toolbox as to how to answer that question for somebody else. I hope that's what we can do over the next several weeks. And as you sit there and hopefully spend some time thinking through, what questions do I have? What questions have I pushed down? I want to leave you with the words of Jesus. We find them in Matthew chapter 7, verses 7 through 8, where he says, ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, everyone who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks, the door will be opened. Church, today and this week, and as we move forward, I encourage you, ask, seek, and knock. And whatever you do, don't hide. Would you pray with me? God, I do thank you for being the God, not a God, the God who came and who walked among us, who gave up your position of power and authority in your kingdom for a moment to come down and to become one of these creatures that you created, and then to give up even that very life. God, I thank you for the evidence that you gave us, for the proof that you showed us, through the power that you displayed. But God, the reality is that was 2,000 years ago. And we live in a world that questions whether or not any of that happened. And sometimes those questions and those doubts, they invade our minds and they invade our hearts. And sometimes, God, we become afraid to admit that. God, I pray that today, this next week, over the next several weeks and beyond that you would break down those walls of fear, and that you would, well, as you told your followers that we needed that faith of a child, that you would help us once again to have the faith of a child who is willing to ask questions and not be afraid that someone's going to think we're foolish, but that we would know with full confidence that you are a God who embraces those, who loves to hear them, who doesn't lecture us for having them, but who will also answer. Thank you, God, for being you. Amen.